Good morning, Calvary Baptist Church. Today we're going to be talking about the price of redemption. We're going to be looking again at the book of Hosea. The passage we're going to look at we haven't studied yet. And I want to show you the verses here and see if we can start to make sense of it together. All right, you ready? Let's look at Hosea 3. And the Lord said to me, says the prophet Hosea, go again. Now there's your clue. You're in chapter 3 here. Go again means some kind of second command. Something later on. So this is probably not the beginning of the prophet's relationship with his wife Gomer. He says, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Now, if you remember our study previously in the book of Hosea, you remember that Hosea's wife Gomer was unfaithful to him. And here we kind of, we see the picture of it a little more clearly. She's loved by another man. Now, it sounds like she is either still in this relationship or perhaps it's a relationship that has intervened between Hosea and Gomer's relationship. So she's described as still loved by this man. In other words, it put a mark on her relationship with Hosea the prophet. Or it could be something still ongoing. It's hard to tell at this point. Even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. Now remember, the prophet Hosea was given the charge to marry Gomer, and it was a metaphor, an analogy for God's relationship with Israel. So here Hosea is commanded to go back and love her again. And we'll explain a little bit more of what that means in a few moments. But let's go to the next verse. The prophet says, so I bought her, and this is again Gomer, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer and a lethek of barley. Now notice what he says to her after that. He says, and I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. That's very strong language, isn't it? Or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. So this little passage that we read today, there's just these 3 verses here, are a snapshot from the life of Hosea. And they center on the concept, the theme of redemption. So we want to talk about that. But let's back up just a moment here and talk about the stages of Hosea's life with Gomer so that we know kind of where we're at in the story. These verses just intrude on us as we're reading through, and if we're not careful, we can get confused as far as where we're at in the story. So let's back up and I went over it a little bit. I want to go over it more thoroughly again and kind of walk through the stages of Hosea's life with Gomer so we're clear where we're at now in the story. Now, Hosea and Gomer were married. Hosea, in fact, was commanded to marry her, or at least a woman like her. Look at what these verses say here at the beginning of the book. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, so this is like his call. Prophets often received special messages when they were called, and those messages of their initial calling marked their entire prophetic ministry often. It was like a indicative of how God would speak to them throughout the decades of their preaching. The Lord said to Hosea, go. Now remember the verses we saw previously said go again. So this is the first go. Go, take to yourself a wife. Now, up to that point, it sounds relatively normal. The prophet Isaiah, for instance, was told to go to his wife and have a kid and to name him a certain name. Jeremiah was told not to take a wife. Ezekiel was told that his wife would die as part of the message that he had to send to Israel. So up to this point, the idea of the prophet's professional career impending on his personal life is relatively normal. There's no, like, this is my job and this is my home life and keep them separate. They're all mixed together. They're all under the umbrella of God's authority. But what we get next is really extreme by any prophet. And the prophets were extreme, if nothing else. But this is beyond the normal extremes. Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So he's got to take a wife of what it says here of whoredom, an unfaithful woman. Now, we've talked about this briefly. Scholars don't know if Gomer was already a woman with a bad reputation in Hosea's town, if she had a background in prostitution, if she had been unfaithful as a single woman or as a married woman. We don't know that. This kind of whoredom could include all of those things. A lot of people think, and I'm generally of this opinion, that Gomer was someone who would prove to be unfaithful, and God was telling Hosea to go take her as his wife. Now, whether Gomer knew that's a very interesting question, one we can't answer. So he's to go take her and marry her. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. Now, notice halfway through this little command from God, he says not only go take a wife, but have children. And Hosea and Gomer had children. They had 3 children, in fact. They had 3 kids. They had a boy named Jezreel. They had a girl named No Mercy. She must have been an incredible athlete, right? No Mercy, a rough girl. That's not really the point. She was a symbol, right? It's not about her personality or character. It's about what she represents. She was a symbol of the fact that God was going to bring wrath on the people. She was a walking prophecy, an omen. And then Hosea and Gomer have a third child, a boy named Not My People. And that's to symbolize the divorce that's going to take place between God and Israel. That's how Jeremiah describes the sending away of God's people, the northern tribes, into exile. He describes it as a divorce. And that's what Hosea was emphasizing a century and a half before Jeremiah, and about 20 to 30 years before it ever happened. So they had 3 kids. Now, I just let that percolate through your system for a moment, thinking about Hosea and Gomer's relationship. We're reading a couple of chapters and we can do it in a matter of minutes, but it apparently is encapsulating years of their life to have 3 kids together. And remember, if a woman continues to feed her child, breastfeed her child, she's less likely to become pregnant again while she's doing that. It's not foolproof, but it's less likely. So there's a really good chance, having 3 kids, they were married for 8 to 10 years. I mean, at least, what, 4 to 5 years? At least, minimum. And for as long as 8 to 10 years. So this was a real marriage. This was a real home. But at some point, and we don't know exactly when, at some point Gomer left Hosea for another man or other men. Now I say it like that because the prophetic kind of oracles that Hosea gives are supposed to represent both his relationship with his wife and God's relationship with Israel. And there are oracles in chapter 2 that could be describing the woman, the earthly woman, Gomer, and could be describing the nation of Israel. And we're not always sure exactly who's getting referred to, and they blend together. And that's part of his artistry for the prophet to keep you guessing as to who he's talking about. But she eventually left, and if parts of chapter 2 can be describing Gomer, then she had multiple lovers. But she had at least one, we know, from chapter 3, because she was, quote, loved by another man, a man other than Gomer. So their home was wrecked. Look at what he says here in chapter 2. The prophet says, plead with your mother, plead. And again, we're not exactly sure where the break between Israel and Gomer is in this chapter. He seems to start talking about like it's the object of the discussion is Gomer, but by the time you get to the end of the chapter, it's clearly Israel. At what point there's a break, we don't know. But if this is talking about Gomer, and I think there's a good chance it has some reference to Gomer, then she's no longer his wife. Look what we see here. Plead with your mother, plead. So he's talking to the children that had just been described and named. For she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery. So it looks like what happened was a divorce. Now, divorce in modern American culture takes a ton of paperwork. It takes time. It's not an instantaneous thing. In ancient Israel, well, in ancient culture, it could often be done with simply just a pronouncement. You could just say, I divorce you. I think in Muslim culture, it's still that way. In ancient Israelite culture, there was a command. Is it in Deuteronomy where they have to write a bill of divorce, and that's to protect the woman. That was the reason it was done, so that the woman could have proof that she was divorced. That would affect the money that her father had given to her husband and her rights going forward. So it was a means of a protection for the woman to give her a bill of divorce, a writing that actually would say that she's divorced. And presumably someone would need to witness that. For documents like that, they typically witnessed it, the elders or someone in the city. Whatever the case, there was a break in the marriage. And if this is describing it, then it was a full break to the point that she was no longer his wife. And generally, in Jeremiah seems to make hints to this as well. When a woman left her husband and lived with another man, the marriage was considered over. There was no, at that point, decision whether or not you are going to take them back as your wife and forgive them. It's simply over. You can read Jeremiah 2 to see that. Now, we could ask a lot of questions. Why did Gomer leave? Like, why did she leave Hosea? Did someone entice her away? Was there some reason why that, she fell in love with someone else, or simply kind of just lost it? If you read Hosea 2, again, if you read Hosea 2 and you think it's talking about Gomer, then she clearly is messed up. Because the things she's doing there, it's kind of, well, it's like the woman at the well in John 4. She had had, what, 5 husbands, and the man that she was with now was not her husband. She was living with a man that was not her husband. We sometimes think these things, this is how people live nowadays, that these kind of things are simply a manifestation of modernity of the last century or even half century in our culture. It was relatively common in the ancient world: divorce, living together, things like this, immorality, even in biblical culture. And there's a reason why these kind of laws are passed in Israel. There's a reason why we see these people in the New Testament, and they flock to Jesus. But why did she leave? We don't really know that. And we could also ask what happened after she left. How long was she gone? How many men did she have? I mean, all of these kind of questions. Did they actually get a divorce, or did she simply go live with another man? We don't know any of the answers to these questions. We could ask them. So we don't really know what happened after she left. But we do know what happened at the end of her story. We do know what happened because we just got through reading it. So we know something about the beginning. They were married. Hosea at least knew she was going to be unfaithful. That was God's purpose in their marriage. They had 3 children. That was part of God's purpose. Presumably those are Hosea's children, even though they're described in ways that could be interpreted otherwise. And we also know that Gomer left and was unfaithful. But we know the end of the story. It's a very interesting story, similar to the prodigal son. Look what happens in chapter 3. God, remember, at the beginning of chapter 3 here in verse 1, God tells Hosea, go love her again, even though she's loved by another man. And then here's the steps that Hosea took. So now we're going to start getting into redemption and the theme that we're going to talk about today. Hosea says this: so I bought her. Now settle down on those words. Look at them carefully. Listen to them carefully. He bought this woman for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and lethek of barley. Now, why would Hosea buy Gomer? Why would he purchase her? How could that kind of situation even arise that he would go buy her back? Well, we have to remember that the redemption, the payment that Hosea is making, is because of Gomer's slavery. That's assumed in this passage. It's not explicitly stated up to this point in the book. It's not even explicitly stated here. It's never said that she's a slave. But everyone in that culture would have known that. If you go redeem someone, you're buying them back from slavery. You're buying them out of slavery. Now, I want to show you a passage from Leviticus 25 These kind of laws are in the background and in the back of the mind of Hosea's writings and also the audience that Hosea is talking to. So they all know what's going on in these kind of redemption situations. But we have to read this so that we can figure out what we're talking about. You're buying a person. Why are you buying a person? Well, here it gives us an example of why. And there's multiple laws in Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy that deal with purchasing people. And they're not always what you think. Look at what it says here. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich. So here's a foreigner coming in. Let's just say he's from Texas. You've got a non-Israelite coming in from Texas, and he becomes rich. Let's say he's an oil man, and your brother beside him becomes poor. So you've got a brother. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the son of your father and mother. Brother could include cousins, second cousins, nephews, things like that. It's your relative, and it doesn't just have to be a man. This stands in for your relative, one of your kinsmen, somebody from your clan. Remember, these extended families in Israel were a big deal, as they were in a lot of ancient cultures. Your brother beside whom becomes poor. So this foreigner becomes very wealthy, and this Israelite becomes very poor, and you see it. And this Israelite sells himself to the stranger or sojourner. He sells himself to the Texas oil man, to continue the metaphor I'm using, or to a member of the stranger's clan. So he sells himself to a foreigner, to a non-Israelite. Then what are you supposed to do when you see that? Remember, this triggers something deep in the Israelite soul. Their birthmark is the exodus from Egypt, which is the redemption from slavery. This is why God calls the Sabbath the sign of the covenant, because it is rest for slaves. He redeemed his people. That's how it's described from Egypt. He redeemed them. He brought them out of slavery to give them a land of milk and honey in which they could rest. And so they celebrate that rest from slavery, because slaves never rested in the ancient world. They never got time off like workers do nowadays with like the 5-day work week. They were enslaved. Salvation for the Israelites from slavery was the core value of their identity as a people. So to see a foreigner come in and to see an Israelite sell himself back to a foreigner is a reversal of the Exodus. It's a no-no. He might have to do it, but if you see it happen, you've got to stop it. You've got to reverse it. And it doesn't come, you don't reverse it by killing the foreigners. You reverse it by paying for that brother. Now, it says, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. So he sells himself to the foreigner, and he's redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him. Now, we use this term redeem nowadays. We use it in spiritual Christian circles. We also use it, we don't usually use it for paying off debt or paying things away, but we use it sometimes for financial things like redeeming your mileage points, right? Or redeeming some kind of points on your credit card. It basically means to exchange it to get it. You somehow get it. But redemption in the biblical model is really just a way of paying for something. You buy it out, usually out of some kind of holding. You buy it from someone else. Now, let's ask this question, why would someone sell themselves to a foreigner? You got to understand that part here. So this is voluntary. This isn't a person who's enslaved, captured in the slave trade. This is a citizen of Israel who sells himself to a wealthy foreigner who has a business in Israel. And then someone else can buy him out. But why would he sell himself in the first place? And the answer is easy. Debt. That's how it's described in the Old Testament. People fall deep into debt. They cannot get out. Leviticus deals with this extensively. How do we deal with our debt? People think sometimes the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about this life and how we live in financial terms. It has quite a bit to say. And Leviticus has a lot to say. So this person is in debt, and the debt is so great they have to pay it. and they owe this foreigner. Maybe they didn't have good crops one year, or maybe they wanted to extend their crops to buy another field. They borrowed money from someone. They borrowed money from a wealthy person, could not pay it back. What do? They take your land, but you owe more than that. So you end up selling yourself. Now, the selling is not eternal. It's not for the rest of your life. It's not in Israel, at least. You sell yourself for a certain number of years. So it's a form of slavery, but you can also call it being an indentured servant. It's not exactly like slavery in Egypt where they could not escape. It was, I sell myself to you. There are certain protections I have still under the law, but I basically don't get to tell myself what to do. You tell me when to work. You tell me how much I get paid. You tell me where I live. All of those things. So it's in many ways like a form of slavery. It is based on finances, and it is generally temporary for a certain number of years, but not always. Now, this means that Hosea must pay for Gomer because she had sold herself into slavery. That's what we should understand. That's what the Israelites understood. We come to it, we have to kind of figure it out. But that's what's going on. She was a slave now because she had sold herself into slavery, because she was poverty stricken. She had lost everything. It's a bit ironic because in Hosea chapter 2, when it describes the unfaithful woman, now again, whether this is Israel or Gomer, it's hard to tell, but it talks about her looking for gifts, for wages, for payment from her lovers, and she goes from that deep into debt. It sounds a lot like the prodigal son, but here it's a woman who is not wealthy, who's depending on other people, but there comes a time where they simply don't support her anymore. Hosea then, to get her back, this is what we have to understand. To get her back, he must pay for her because someone else now owns her. Now, whether that was one of her former lovers, whether she simply got into debt and could not get out of the debt and had to sell herself to a wealthy person somewhere who was not a romantic partner, we don't know. But to get her back, you could ask the question why he would want her back after everything that happened. To get her back, he had to pay for her. So let's just understand the situation then. This is not like slavery in the antebellum South. This is not ethnically based. These are all Israelites. This is not typically permanent. Typically, at least for men, it's not permanent. Now, it could become permanent for women if they were purchased and then as a bride. So a father could sell his daughter as a bride to a wealthy person who could then marry her. It's was just probably a slightly different financial situation than simply giving your daughter away. Remember, most of these marriages were arranged. So typically the father would send money with the daughter and then she would marry another man. The father would actually pay a little bit. And this situation, it seems like the father's receiving money. So maybe this is a poor man and someone wants to marry his daughter. We get a few laws like that. But in general, it was a temporary thing. Gomer's situation is a little murky. She's not being sold as a daughter unless her father, Diblaim, is doing it. She's not being sold as a daughter, as a bride for someone. She's simply sold for a certain period of years. So it's different from what we know of slavery in American history. That doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's positive, but it does mean it's not ethnically based. It does also mean that it's self-imposed. You do it to yourself to pay your debts. And it also means generally it's temporary. Now, how much did Hosea pay? This is an interesting question here. How much is a human being worth? I don't know how much the slaves were worth economically in the South. It's a terrible thing to think of. How much would you pay for a human being? Well, look what Hosea gives here. He actually gives us the price. Why do you think he does that? It would be one thing to say, I redeemed her. I paid for her debts and now she belongs to me. He could say that, but he actually goes into the price, and look what he says. It's so detailed. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. Now, this is probably what would probably be classified as historians call the ring of truth. Sometimes in history books and from ancient history, people debate whether something really happened. They do it for the Bible too, but they do it for all kind of history books. And historians will talk about the ring of truth. It's just something that seems so authentic, it's hard to question it. And this just has that feeling of authenticity to it. It's so specific. Can you see that? It said, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. Now, most of you probably don't know how much 15 shekels of silver is, and I doubt you know how much a homer and a lethek of barley is as far as what it looks like. Well, here's about the amount of silver Hosea would have paid. 15 shekels sounds like a lot of money. They were very thin little coins, so it's not that much. Leviticus actually gives us the price that it should be for a person when they sell themselves. And it's for someone like for Gomer, it would be around, I believe it was around 30 shekels. So the 15 shekels of silver is the first half of that payment. But then we also are told, what does he say here? A homer and a lethek of barley. Now, this is about how much barley it would have been. These are, of course, apples. It's really hard to find a picture of around 10 bushels of barley on Google image search, but I did find the apples. This is about how much barley it would have been. So this plus this is the price of a woman in ancient Israel. It's interesting when you go back and you look at the sequence of this, what Hosea thinks he's doing with this. I mean, it could sound really crude, couldn't it? It could sound terrible, oppressive, to think of someone buying another human being, of a man buying a woman. But look at the context that we get here. It doesn't sound terrible at all. The Lord said to me, go again, love a woman, and remember what this woman had done to Hosea. Most people would not do this for someone who had committed adultery on them and left them. I don't know if it was in Hosea's desires to do this. He's told by God to do it. He said, go again, love a woman. Not just go buy her and treat her cruelly, but go love her. He said, so I bought her. So his purchase of his unfaithful wife, now in slavery, rather than gloat over her, is to purchase her because he loves her. He's going to show her love. Can you imagine her face when she saw Hosea show up to buy her? I don't know if it was an auction or if he simply went to the owner of her after he found out that she was enslaved. Whatever the case, he comes and he buys her, and then look what he says to her. We actually get this dialogue. Well, it's a monologue. He just tells her something. He says, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So now that he's bought her, he can lock down her fidelity, not just as her husband, but as her owner, her master, at least depending on how we interpret the laws, for a certain number of years. You must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. Up to that point, it sounds like he's throwing his weight around, right? He's the master. But then he follows with this. So will I also be to you. In other words, you're going to be faithful to me, and I'm going to be faithful to you. You will be for me, and I will be for you. It reminds me of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians about how the wife's body doesn't belong to the wife, but to the husband. But then he continues, and the husband's body doesn't belong to the husband, but to his wife. They own each other. That sounds like what he's saying here. Certainly Gomer doesn't own Hosea the prophet in any kind of legal, economic sense, but he essentially promises her that, at least in the relational sense. So Hosea now has a double right to Gomer. He was her husband and her legal owner. He had a claim over her as her husband for her to be faithful. If she would had left him, there were laws that condemned adultery. I don't know how much they were enforced. Now, though, he's got another band to wrap around their relationship, which is ownership. And this happened. People married their slaves. There are laws about this. Generally, as I told you, a father would sell his daughter when someone wanted to marry her if he didn't have, perhaps he didn't have the money for a bride price. Marriages came down to a lot more economic decision than what we sometimes think of marriage as. That's largely because we're affluent now. In the ancient world, and with the poverty rates and subsistence farming and people just barely getting by, marriage was often not just about butterflies in the stomach or how cute the guy's eyes were. It was often about the ability to feed yourself and to feed your family and to raise kids that you could actually take care of. But Hosea now has a double right to Gomer. And here's what's interesting, and this is the whole point. If we don't get to the next step in this discussion, we've missed the whole thing. This is used as an example of God's redeeming love. And that's exactly what he says. When God says, go love a woman again and do all of this, and Hosea does it, God follows up with, for the children of Israel. I want you to do that because the children of Israel, and he starts to talk about their future with God. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God. So you see the parallels here. Hosea's wife, Gomer, is unfaithful, leaves him. Their marriage breaks down. He goes out and finds her, buys her out of her slavery, and binds her to himself in a new doubled relationship of husband and owner. In the same way, God had redeemed Israel from Egypt. They had been unfaithful. He had essentially married them as their husband, and they were unfaithful. They went away, and God says he's going to bring them back again. So that arc of being married, being unfaithful, then coming back, being brought back, that is present in Hosea's life is going to be duplicated in God's relationship with his people. God will one day redeem his people. That's what this is really all about. It's not fundamentally about Hosea. Hosea is a way of understanding God's relationship with Israel. It's an image. Now, we need to think about ourselves here. So let's move to a different gear and think about our relationship with our Savior, with our Redeemer. Because Christ redeemed us. He redeemed you with his blood. That's the price of redemption. The price of redemption for Gomer was pitiful. It's that little silver bar. It's those bushels of barley. I mean, you can hand it over to somebody. You can put it on a cart. It's not that much money. It's ridiculous that it's so little for a human being to own a human life, at least for a certain period of years. But it's relatively little money, right? It's relatively little currency. What's the price of our redemption? We just looked at the price of Gomer's redemption. You can put it in a pickup truck. You can value it easily. You can weigh it in a balance. How do we value, how do we weigh, how do we evaluate the blood of our Savior, the blood of God that redeemed us, that purchased us? Look at some of these verses. Acts 20:28. The church of God, which he, God, purchased with his own blood. 1 Peter 1. For you know that you were redeemed from your empty way of life inherited from the fathers, not with perishable things like silver or gold, or we could add barley, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. He calls it the precious blood, the valuable. Ephesians 1, we have redemption in him through his blood. We are bought through his blood. Now, if you've been thinking a little bit of ahead at this point, you probably are thinking, wait a minute. I understand that Hosea had to pay something for Gomer. She was enslaved and she owed bills she could not pay. What do I owe? What is Christ's blood payment for? Well, Ephesians 1 has it right here. Look at what it says in the second half of the verse. The forgiveness of our sins. His blood was payment for what you've done wrong. Now you think about your sins for just a moment. Let them pile up in your mind. The ones you've done this week, the ones you did when you were young, the ones you've done in secret, the ones you've done against people you loved or against people you hated. All of those sins need to be paid. They need to be paid because they're debts. Matthew 6, the Lord was teaching his disciples to pray, and he says, forgive us our debts. Another form of the Lord's Prayer in a different gospel says, forgive us our trespasses. They're the same thing. Sin is not simply a mistake. It's not simply missing the mark. That's one of the definitions of sin. It's also a debt. It creates a debt that must be paid. There's an honor and a glory due to God from every one of us. When we fail to do it, we sin. And we might fail to do it by simply not acting when we should, not speaking up for Christ when we should, not telling the truth but remaining silent, being afraid of being identified with Jesus Christ, being ashamed of him as Peter was. That could be a form of debt. Or it could be transgressing, stepping over the line, doing things we know we should not do. All of that creates a debt. Sin is a form of debt. Now, we could talk about how much we owe. Gomer owed more than she could pay. We do too. Because, you see, every individual sin isn't simply an act on the human sphere. It's not simply against other humans that we're acting. We're acting against our Creator. And our Creator is an infinite person. So every sin that we commit, you could say, echoes for eternity in the being of God. It's an eternal offense. He is an eternal person. Our sins are infinite in their value, because in their debt, because they go against an infinite person who is infinitely worthy of our love and adoration and affection and obedience. It's a form of debt. It's a terrible form of debt that cannot be repaid. We are all beggars. We are all deeply in debt, and we cannot pay it. What could possibly pay for the sin of our soul? One of the prophets asked that. Could it be this silver? Could it be 9, 10, 11 bushels of barley? What will we give for the sin of our soul? Someone else gave us something. When we stood on the slave block, Jesus Christ stepped up and shed his own blood to pay for your sin, your debts. He paid for it. And God looked at the infinite blood of Jesus Christ and was satisfied, because he sent that lamb for us. The Father sent that lamb to pay the debt that we could not pay, that we owed to him. That is the price of redemption.